Welcome to tonight's Digital Thinking. I am Liz Mosley and I am doing my first one of these. I've been a chat host many a time. This is my first one editing, and I'm delighted to be joined by the MP for Birmingham Yardley, Jess Phillips, who has not yet done her own fringe trim, but that is coming.
We could do it live, couldn't we? We could do it on here.
I think definitely a haircut thinking would be good. If you haven't joined us for Digital Thinking before, you're very, very welcome. It's a really big group of people we've got today, over 250 people so far, and I think there are more trickling in. So just to let you know a little bit how it all works, if you the point of a thinking is to try and have a conversation that involves as many people as we can. We obviously want to hear from Jess. We're going to talk about the book that she's written. We'll talk a bit about the Labour Party and what's happening in the world. But we want to hear from you and get your perspectives and ideas and respond to some of the things that we bring up. So if you'd like to join in, there's two ways of doing that. Firstly, you can put up your little blue digital hand. So if you can find the participants button somewhere on the screen, or if you're on a laptop, it'll be in the middle at the bottom. If you're on other devices, it might be up there somewhere. You can find your little blue hand in the raise hand button. There you go. I can see some people demonstrating their ability to put their hands up. See for Nick Stone, if you want to say something, do that, and I'll come to you. Alternatively, you can use the chat function. You can type with my colleague Katie Vanek-Smith, who's the co-founder of Tortoise. She is living in the chat at the moment, so feel free to type away, raise points, argue with one another in a nice way, and we'll see where we get to. That's it. Jess Phillips has been MP for Birmingham Yardley since 2015. She, of course, ran for the Labour leadership last year. She's a brilliant campaigner for women's rights, and as of a couple of weeks ago, very recently, has been appointed in Keir Starmer's new shadow cabinet as Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. Have I said that right, Jess?
Yeah, I think so.
And we were just having a chat before everybody came in about how you're coping with the lockdown, with working, you've got kids and everything else, and just tell us a bit about how Parliament is going to work as of today. It started today, right?
Today, yeah. So today it was just as it always is, apart from there was hardly anyone there, although that happens sometimes as well. So today they had to move the motion to make it so that tomorrow it could change. Because nothing can happen in Parliament unless Parliament has agreed to it. So it had to go back today as it normally would. And so from tomorrow, there will be a hybrid model where you can go, but they're not going to allow more than 50 MPs in the chamber at any one time. And you have to be 2 meters apart, and there'll be allocated seating and things. But, and 120 MPs can join in online. And they've put up all screens in Parliament and everything. So I have requested to take part in one of the debates tomorrow online. So we shall see what it will be. There's no facility for voting yet. That is yet to. Yeah. So what they are trying to do, and what they said today, is that they're not going to put forward any contentious business that would need a vote. So it was meant to be, today was meant to be the second reading of the immigration bill. But I can think that they probably considered that would be contentious, so that has been moved until such time as we would be able to vote on things.
Right. And what's the vibe like in general of you and your fellow MPs? Are people freaking out about the ability to just get stuff done, or are people fairly chilled about it? How are people feeling?
I mean, people become institutionalised very, very quickly to the situation that they find themselves in, and MPs aren't really that different. They're very, obviously, quite institutionalised people in lots of ways. We're part of a very weird institution. But I think that the real panic is that, we're in a national crisis, and there's quite a lot of things that are coming up for our constituents that we just don't really have an avenue to raise publicly. And Parliament's been on recess for 3 weeks in the middle of a national crisis. There are many models all around the world of countries and how they're dealing with this. And the one I think personally is the best is in New Zealand. They've made sort of like a scrutiny board that is chaired by the leader of the opposition. that is specifically about scrutinising how the government is dealing with the crisis and the crisis response, and that just seems a really grown-up way to do it. I've had to watch night after night while lobby journalists are allowed to question ministers in public, and I'm not allowed to. And no disrespect to lobby journalists, lots of them are doing brilliant research and asking brilliant questions, but they're, you know, my constituents, they deserve a voice to ask questions about their PPE, their testing, their and it coming from MPs, it is also just much more directly linked to the people who are suffering on the ground.
It's an ugly segue. We're going to talk about Jess's book. Here it is, Truth to Power: 7 Ways to Call Time on BS, aka bullshit. And as you can see by my strategically placed, they're not just for show, the post-it notes. I have read the book, and I've got some. It's interesting reading a book like this at a time like this, because it's kind of a rallying cry. It's a sort of a call to arms. It's quite rousing. It's quite angry in places, but it's also very funny. And it seems to me the core message of the book is to get people to believe that they can do something, whatever the problem is, that you can do a thing about it. Because, you know, in the introduction it says we've got to call time on the bullshit that makes us feel as if we are powerless. And I think lots of people in lockdown have felt incredibly powerless for various reasons. I mean, if you're Lady Gaga, you can get Elton John to play I'm Dill Danding in his garden, or if you're the amazing guy, the Captain Tom Moore, you can walk around your garden and earn bazillions of pounds to the NHS. But if you're on furlough, or if you're a key worker, or if you're just trying to homeschool the kids whilst balancing working from home, or whatever, you're just a normal bod, you see the chaos and the unfairness and the panic and the fear, and it is hard to know where to start. What would you say to those of us who feel, oh my God?
Yeah, I think that there is a huge amount of feeling of powerlessness at the moment, because we are essentially overpowered by the rules that are being put in place. Not badly, but that is how lots of people feel. But there has also just been an absolute outpouring of people who got up and did something. Almost everything good that has happened in the lockdown happened because somebody, not bloody Lady Gaga maybe, but she, you know, fair play to her. If she wants to get Elton John, I didn't watch it myself, but there's just lots of people all across the country going, do you know what, I'm going to get my mates together on a WhatsApp group and we're going to start sewing gowns for the NHS. And you know what, I'm gonna get up I'm an, you know, elderly man, and I'm gonna walk up and down and raise money. That people can do much more than they think during the lockdown. To gain power at this time, or to fight against bad power structures at this time, is incredibly hard. Actually, the rhetoric from the very beginning has been based on a pulling together and a not, you know, sort of having a pop at people. We've all got to try and get, and actually in reality that you know, there will be people. Oh, what's that now? Music?
I don't know.
It's not me.
Sure. It's not me either.
Oh well, I liked it. But the reality will be is that there will be exploitation. There will be bad management by governments and businesses that is going on. And people need to be able to feel that they can stand up. So very early on in the crisis, I had a cleaner at a local primary school to me. She wasn't employed by the local primary school. She was employed by an agency.
Yeah.
And she hadn't yet received her shielding letter to say that she was in the category of people who needed shielding. Funnily enough, my mother received one of those letters, and she's been dead for 10 years. So the system was obviously working perfectly. So she hadn't received her letter. She was a cleaner in the local school, and she had got in touch with her union rep and said, well, you know, they're telling me I have to go in, and they're saying that they're not going to pay me more than sick pay, because if I'm off sick, but I've got this shielding letter, I'm expecting it, but it hasn't come yet. But she had cancer. This is a woman who had cancer. And so she got in touch with me, and we got in touch with the agency. And she has been paid in full not to be at work for the entire time. Now, if that woman had just thought, well, there's nowhere I can go, there's nothing worth trying, she would currently be on statutory sick pay, probably now no longer on statutory sick pay. And I remember saying to her on the phone very early on, I said, look, do you want me, because loads of people got in touch with us about bad practice in their business in the very early days. Call centres seem to be a real specific problem. And we were saying, do you want us to go to your bosses, go to this organisation with with a specific case about you, or just a general, because we don't want you to get into trouble? And the vast majority of people didn't want to get into trouble and were frightened about being fingered for being a sort of troublemaker at work, which is absolutely in the book. I talk all about the risks that you might have to take to stand up to it. But this woman, this cleaner who had cancer, she said, you know what, you tell them, it's really specifically about me, that I want you to use my name. And it was just this momentary act of defiance by this woman, and there are all sorts of really, really inspiring people out there. They just have to believe often that they can do something. That's the very first challenge, is believing that you can. If you try. You're not always going to win. I don't always win. I mean, I often don't win. But if you raise your voice, it is remarkable actually how much you can change if you believe that you have. Well, not just believe, if you access the power structures that you have, whether that's the trade union, whether that's your member of parliament, whether that's your own ability to organise.
Yes, interesting. I'm going to come to Hugo Labou, I think maybe I'll say your name, or Hugo Labou.
An excellent name.
It's an excellent name. Hugo, hello.
Hi there. Sorry, Hugo Liebus.
Hugo Liebus.
You ruined it, Hugo.
Sorry.
It's a great name.
You wanted to say something about whether Parliament is entirely absorbed then by the response to the virus, or if there's other stuff happening.
Yes, no, I know. So I just wanted to ask. So I imagine for you, Jess, you must be incredibly excited, sort of to get going with your new shadow ministerial role, and you must have so much planned and so much that you want to do. I was wondering, now that Parliament is back in session, whether your colleagues and yourself feel like parliamentary life is fairly dominated by the virus, or whether legislation may be pushed to the side as a result, or whether you feel like you can sort of properly get on with your job as usual, despite it.
I mean, it's a totally unknown feat at the moment. I have no idea how it's all going to fall, but there will still be legislation, but it has to, by its very nature, be non-contentious legislation. So the domestic abuse bill, which was due to be coming back before Easter, but obviously the crisis hit. I very much expect that in the next week, because it's seen as being non-contentious at second reading stage. So second reading just means we have a debate. I don't know why we call it reading. The first reading is just they put a copy of it in the vote office. No one actually reads it. I feel like somebody should stand and read it out if it's called a reading. But the second reading is considered to be not contentious, because and it won't call for a vote. So legislation still will be going through. And for me, that is, it is both good, but also has real potential for flaws, not necessarily in the legislation that passes, but the ability to scrutinise in a time where bandwidth is so taken up with the crisis that the normal levers that you would pull, and certainly some of the things I talk about in the book about getting attention for the things that you want to change, will be incredibly hard in a time of crisis. And so some of the things like amendments that you might put down to the domestic abuse bill around migrant women or something, that you would in normal times hope to see a big surge of public support, so that people, and you get cross-party MPs saying that they'll vote a certain way, the likelihood of that happening, I think, is quite narrow in this time. And also the idea that the government can just sort of get over and done with without scrutiny some of the things that are less contentious. And to me, the domestic abuse bill is, we all want it. I don't not want it, I want it. I mean, I don't just want it, I've literally feel like I've been dragging them for the last 3 years to get it in front of Parliament. But I don't think it's not contentious at all. I do think it is. It's just not contentious at the second reading. the bill committee, I do think that there is quite a lot that I want to see changed in it, and what I don't want to be seen is just sort of palmed off as like, oh, not that important at the moment, because whilst we are living in a pandemic, you know, many thousands, if not millions of people, in fact, in the country have been living with the epidemic of domestic abuse for a very, very long time.
I did want to talk to you about the domestic abuse thing. Jess was featured in a podcast that we published in Tortoise at the beginning of April, in which you said that the stay-at-home message is stronger than the escape message, and obviously you've been making the point, which is horrible to think about, that it's not. I don't want to use the word only. It's not those people who are already in abusive relationships who are at risk, but the fact that during the lockdown some relationships will become abusive for the first time, and that's one of the things that's so terrifying about it. And you've talked in other articles and things about how sort of the awareness of and strategies for de-escalation of domestic abuse need to be part of the public health messaging, all related to what's happening in the lockdown. And then there's also been some really interesting stuff about hotels. Could you just unpack a bit all of that stuff for us?
So from the beginning, long before I had the job that I've been given, and since, I mean, really from the beginning of the lockdown, in my house we call it BL or AL, before lockdown or after lockdown. So when the writing was on the wall, lots of us were making the point that for lots of people, home isn't safe, and you know, that taking your chances with the virus for lots of people will be better than potentially being murdered. And unfortunately, during the lockdown, we've seen a spike in murder, domestic murder. And the trouble is that what we needed was for the government to, in the beginning, recognise that there needed to be a strategy for not just women who are victims of domestic violence, but children who are suffering abuse at home. That there needed to be a proper strategy of how they were going to deal with any upturn or even any downturn, because a downturn in reporting to me is much more terrifying than an upturn, in fact. Especially there's some data around saying that the number of child protection cases coming forward is dropping, and that is just harrowing, the thought of that. That there needed to be a number of different strategies. So one was you know, a proper public health campaign that said if you're not safe at home, you don't have to stay, you can escape. And also that, you know, while things are stressful at home, here are numbers of people, or this is what you should be doing with regard to this. That was one part of it. Another part of it was that we needed to make routes for escape for people, so phone lines, web chats, that sort of thing, and we needed resource to do that. But that only covers the first call. Then once somebody is called that, you need to have proper support put in place for them by specialist agencies, to make sure that you don't just lose them after the first call. And some of that would be escape. Now, we recognise that 60% of women who come forward to refuge don't get accommodation anyway. BL. At BL, they didn't get housed anyway.
No. And
we thought how awful it was going to be in the crisis if people's risks were massively escalating, that they would need escape. So we just, I mean, in the spirit of helping, we went and spoke to lots of hotels and university halls and other accommodation to say, look, in the crisis, can this be put in place? Because I've had to turn women away already, because there's no refuge accommodation available in Birmingham at the moment. It certainly wasn't then. And so we sort of put together this idea of a strategy, but the government, unfortunately, just hasn't picked it up. They still haven't put in place any. All they've done is say we're going to have like a campaign, which I have to say I haven't seen anything of yet.
No.
Certainly can't see it on the streets where I live.
No.
They've said that the domestic violence charities can go through the normal charity route, when what we were asking for was a specific and targeted fund for victims of violence and abuse at home. And for the government to underwrite the costs of the hotel accommodation. So far, still waiting for all of those things to be done.
There are a couple of people, there's lots of people in the chat, Andrew Gray and John Wilson and others, asking if there are specific things that they can do to help on the domestic abuse front? Is it give money to Women's Aid and Refuge?
Yeah, I mean,
Is that the
I
thing?
think, yeah, so signing up to the various petitions that are going around is one thing. So there's one specifically around the hotel and emergency accommodation run by South All Black Sisters. You can also, donate to Women's Aid would absolutely, or even better, donate to your local women's refuge. Because, you know, Refuge and the charity Refuge, not the building refuges, the charity Refuge and Women's Aid, they have been given some of the funding, some big pots of funding from the government, still never be enough, but they also, for the helpline and for the web chats, that sort of local charities that are dealing with people much more directly on the ground, they will be getting much less of it. And also it will help with things like we appeal to Netflix to give free subscriptions to all women's refuges because kids are in lockdown in there and stuff like that. I can't say I was particularly happy with the response, but things like being able to fund things like that in your local refuges would be really helpful. The other thing that you can do is write to your member of parliament to tell them to care about it, to tell them to raise it up. That, you know, if we were talking about domestic violence in the same way that we're quite rightly talking about PPE, I really think the government would have done more.
Yeah, agreed. I'm going to come to Avril Moore, who's got her little blue digital hand up, who has a question about, well, what would it be called? So we've got BL before lockdown. PL, and then
after lockdown,
after everything else.
After. I see what you mean. I think we're currently in AL. We're going to have to come up with a new thing for.
So Avril,
PL post lockdown.
Post lockdown. Avril, what's your question? Hello.
Hello, Jess. I'm really thrilled that you've got a job in the Shadow Cabinet. I think that's the best place for you because you are somebody that will speak your mind. And I just wanted to ask you what you think. I think whoever was in government would have had to probably throw the same amount of money at this crisis as the Tories have had to. But I wondered what you think their strategy is going to be for paying it back when everything is over. Do you think they're going to go back more towards austerity? And if they are, how will Labour hold them to account for that? Or do you think maybe this will be a turning point and they realise they can't starve public services in the way that they have been doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, one that I don't know the answer to, but I can only sort of hypothesise over what I hope. I think that going back to public sector austerity that we have seen will be, I would hope it would be almost impossible to now suggest that, you know, one of the biggest problems of austerity in Birmingham, where I live, is how that affected services available to vulnerable children and vulnerable adults or just older people. The idea that you could impoverish that further post, you know, Piers Morgan putting like a care worker on Good Morning Britain, giving a cushion to a bereaved old man. Yeah, I really hope that this the sense of this has meant that austerity, but there is other austerities. There are other things that they can deeply impoverish that isn't that stuff. So you know, think of prisons or other services like that that don't have nice memes. We need to make everything meme worthy to protect it in this modern world. Everybody make memes immediately. The way that they're going to pay it back, I mean, I think that they were much more comfortable with the idea of racking up debt before the crisis happened, because there was a sort of, you know, the whole Sajid Javid, Rishi Sunak takeover was that Sajid Javid was much more like lower taxes and be a conservative fiscally, whereas Boris Johnson wants to build bridges, essentially. That's like his thing. No doubt there'll be a bridge built to get us out of this crisis. There'll certainly be lots suggested. And so I don't think Boris Johnson actually has the stomach for the austerity in the same way that his forebears did. So I think that I can only say it's going to be debt and taxation is the way that we're going to get out of this. But we'll be paying this off, I mean, forever and ever. and ever. I mean, this won't be paid off in my lifetime, I don't think.
No.
I can't see how that would be the case.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Albie. Albie, you've got your hand up, and I think your question is about specifically older people in the crisis. Are you there, Albie?
Yeah.
Hi, Albie.
You're not old, Albie.
So I've been working in A&E recently, not as a doctor or anything, but kind of just helping out. And one thing that I've noticed is, while we're very aware that the elderly are vulnerable to the virus, they've been left behind by their carers who are scared of going in, whether it's for lack of PPE, which we've seen in the news, but just anecdotally, I've seen one chap that was left in a seat for 8 days because he just thought, oh, the carer will show up tomorrow. So while we're aware that eventually that there are issues with the virus, I was wondering, how can we stop the elderly being left behind? So and raise awareness to it, and what can the government be doing to help this right now? Because obviously we know that they're not being included in the death figures, but how many preventable deaths are being missed because they're just being left, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's amazing the sort of public awareness throughout the campaign and how perception and expectation has changed. Because at the beginning, when it was in China, it was common parlance to hear people say, I'm not saying that in government or anything, although they've had to rebut this a lot since the very beginning. It was very common parlance to say, well, the kind of people it's going to kill are going to die anyway, as if that was a sort of acceptable metric until it was your dad or your mom who was going to die. And I think that has shifted where we were on that perception, even just 4 weeks ago, let alone 12 weeks ago. I think that we are in a different place about what, and I think for the first time, a bit like universal credit, and that statutory sick pay is £92 for somebody who deals with people who have to live and has been dealing with for years, decades, people who have had to live on £60 a week. It's very, very common in my constituency for that to happen. When the nation woke up to the idea that that might also mean that they had to live on £60 a week at the beginning of this crisis, it was like manna from heaven for people like me to hear people say, you know that sick pay is only £92 a week. And I was like, yeah, read it and weep. I did know that. And there's a very similar thing seems to have happened with the expectation that old people should be looked after, and that carers deserve better pay, and that looking after somebody, you are an advocate, you are clinical in lots of cases, you are not just making somebody nice cups of tea, you are doing a huge amount of difficult and skilled work. And I really, really hope that leads to a change in culture. I think that the reality, and I have always thought that the reality is that we need to have really big and challenging conversations about social care, about the quality of it, about the funding structures of it, about how much people are going to be willing actually to put their hands in their pockets and pay for a national care service akin to that of the National Health Service. And I think that, Captain Tom and now this man with his cushion with his wife on it, it's like the perfect trifecta. The nation absolutely loves an old man, and one in uniform is even like, they love it. And I really, really hope that we come out the other side with much better. I cannot believe, genuinely, I cannot believe that we're still not counting those people's deaths.
Yeah.
That has got to change, and the government seem to be dodging that in a big way. I cannot, but it's almost as if the data doesn't matter. You care about what you count. That is the first rule of politics. Whenever you're fighting any campaign, always ask the question about getting someone to count it. I wrote a whole thing in the book about how you've got to ask certain questions about what is being counted. And often the answer you'll get back when you try and fight for something is, oh, we don't count that. And you know that that's the case, but making people say publicly in a business or in government or in the council, oh, we don't know how many people this has happened to, that will raise an alarm, and that is the beginning of a good campaign. And the fact that we are not counting the deaths of older people is harrowing.
Yeah. Jess, there's quite a few comments in the chat when you talk about, and I think we can all sense it, this thing that we've got a different sense of the value of the people who've been doing the care work, the shit bit basically that everybody'd ignored for ages. How optimistic are you? How confident are you, or is it too soon to say that inside of the Labour Party there's going to be a sort of re-galvanising around that sort of agenda that you can bring and make land?
Oh, I mean, I think that entirely it will be the focus of the Labour Party. The Labour Party will be galvanised to that. And there are pieces of legislation that are coming forward where it will be, there'll be an opportunity to galvanise around it. So the immigration bill that outlines issues around what we consider to be skilled labour in this country is, I mean, I very famously said how I felt about when the threshold was £30,000. The idea that almost everybody in my constituency had no skills was a charming way to be talked for the government to talk about them, because the average wage in my constituency is not £30,000, not even anywhere near. But I really look. I think that there is a need to be bold, and the crisis in one way potentially undoes it a little bit, undoes what could have been because of the amount of money that it's cost. But I do think that we were potentially on the way to having a genuine and honest and adult conversation, cross-party even, about what is needed in social care and what is needed to pay for it and what we're all going to expect for ourselves and our loved ones. If anything, I worry that the crisis and the cost of the crisis might undo a bit of that.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Jennifer Allerton, who's had her hand up for a while, and then Nacho, I can see your hand up too, and you've been there for ages. I'm so sorry, I've scrolled and you've emerged again. So let's go to Jennifer Allerton first, because we've been talking about universal basic income. Jennifer, are you there? Hiya. Oh, hang on, we can't hear you. Wait a minute. Are you mute? Try again. Oh dear, I can't hear you. Well, I'll tell you what, make sure you've switched your computer audio on. And we might come back to you and try again in a second. Nacho, let's come to you. Nacho, are you there? You wanted to talk about the role of select committees and that kind of thing. Hi, Nacho.
Hi, yes.
Hi, we can hear you. Hurrah.
To ask Jess about the role of select committees. The thing is that we are in such a unique and unprecedented circumstance that even in Spain, where the political infighting between different parties is so acrimonious, they have agreed to call a parliamentary commission that would be the equivalent of a select committee to deal with construction. The thing is that would it be the good idea either to have a select committee on how to deal with the post-COVID situation, or maybe another form of cross-party cooperation, so that there can be not only scrutiny but also contributions, since not a unity government is on side, but at least there is a cross-party element that everybody can contribute ideas, experts can contribute, etc. We have a select committee for Brexit, and maybe we should have a reconstruction select committee.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that working out how Parliament is going to work, I think has been the sort of major concern of those who deal with how things work in Parliament over the past week or so. But I absolutely agree. I think that the idea that we would have a select committee for this sort of thing, just like we do with Brexit, and we continue, the Brexit select committee is going to continue to exist long after we've actually transitioned, because the transition is long, and there was a recognition that needs to continue. I think that exactly the same could be said of this. And to be honest, I think that the model of having a sort of select committee that scrutinised the government of cross-party MPs throughout this period. I think it should have been done early on, but it hasn't. So I think that now is the time that should happen. I think that unlike other select committees, though, which are backbench led, I do think that there is some room to have a bit, like I said in the New Zealand model, to not just make that scrutiny function just backbench led. It should be a mixture of both front and backbench, but that it very much is not about scoring political points. And select committees aren't. They really very rarely are, in my experience of them, because I really do feel like, I mean, actually the biggest news story today is about something that was said at a select committee. So the FCO, one of the FCO civil servants came out and said that it was a political decision to not join up with the EU commissioning for PPE and ventilators and things, whereas previously we'd been told that it was that they didn't get the email. Cock up or conspiracy, either way, it's a bungle, and we've had two different stories. But they are definitely the place where really good, proper scrutiny happens.
Yes, there's a couple of comments in the chat, Richard Mills and others, talking about being an MP, specifically being a female MP. And one of the things I noticed when I was reading the book is that you don't talk about your own achievements very much. You talk about the achievements and experiences and campaigns that other people have had. Mm-hmm. But there is one on page 146. You did mention.
Oh, I remember it well. Yeah.
Mention a thing, what you did do, where you'd been in and structured a question. David Cameron was the Prime Minister, about making sure that women's refuges were going to be exempt from changes to housing benefit. You're making a point about how you head off the kinds of objections you know you're going to get back in the question, and then it sort of changes the sort of power balance. So when you get a win like that, it must be a massive buzz, and you just think, well, now I know why I'm doing this, because you're also very honest and upfront about, you know, being an MP and a woman MP is fairly awful. You know, there's the arcane processes, of course, but there's the sexism and the abuse and everything else. But you keep going. Can you bear it? Can you bear being an MP?
I mean, it feels really quite, I'll have to say, the one silver lining of COVID is I feel like the online abuse has dialed itself down a bit. And maybe it's just because I'm not in my office. Not had a death threat yet since COVID, so.
Oh my God!
Yeah, you know, that's there's not many weeks that I can say that. The BBC, funnily enough, were going to come and film outside the front of my house earlier about a story about PPE in my constituency, and I had to say you have to make it so you can't identify where I live, so you can basically see me and a tree because of the threats that I get. And they were like, he was like, oh, this is absolutely harrowing, I'm so sorry. I was like, it's all right, mate. So I can bear it more than other people think that it's unbearable. I think for most people to read about the kind of things that people like me get put through, it you know, when written down in black and white, it seems totally harrowing. However, in the vast majority of cases, it's just one part of your day, and you just brush it aside to be dealt with later. In lots of cases, because you are quite busy, but it is totally worth it, is the truth. Now, I wish it wasn't the case, and I will do everything that I can to structurally change the way that our politics works. And it's not just even that women are more likely to be, you know, harassed, abused, threatened, or suffer the misogyny that means, you know, the glass ceiling exists. The whole of politics is structured the way that every sort of contest element of it is structured. It benefits the people it was designed for, and that is largely well-to-do men. And it's, you know, there is so much. I read a really brilliant piece about the way that women leaders around the world and how their countries are coping in this crisis. And it is fascinating how well the countries that have women leaders are dealing with the crisis, but not just because they are, you know, the organizational level or this, it's that their approach is different. Their approach to connecting with their people is different, and that I just thought was, you know, it was interesting. But yeah, it's totally worth it when you get a win, when they finally, after a year and a half of pestering them to take refuge accommodation out of the changes to housing benefit put through by the welfare reform of austerity. I literally wanted to, I could have like stripped naked and cartwheeled down the halls in Portcullis House. And I remember one time a minister ringing me and telling me, and in fact it will be in the domestic abuse bill, that they were going to make domestic violence refuge provision a statutory duty of local authorities, which is something I have campaigned for, I mean, literally 15 years, that it was going to be a statutory duty. That means there's only 3 statutory duties currently that local authorities have, and that is adult services, children's services, and bins. So finally, women mattered as much as bins, and I felt really thrilled that women mattered as much as bins. But she said you can't say anything to anybody. So this was when I was just still a backbencher. She rang me, the minister, Tory minister, and said, "We're going to do it, Jess. You got your way." And I remember like having to explain statutory duties of the council to my husband just so I could have someone to tell and be excited about. And he was just like not giving me the right reaction at all. He was just sort of like, "Great, well done. Refuges are now a statutory duty. Brilliant." Yeah. It's like, to me, that's like England winning the World Cup.
Yeah, it's amazing. It is an amazing achievement. I do remember the women are as important as bins line. I think that's a brilliant one. I'm gonna go back to Jennifer. Let's give Jennifer another go. Jennifer.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes!
Yay!
Yay! Jennifer.
Yeah, the headphones seem to make it worse, so I took that. Got to remember going back to, we were chatting in the chat part about universal basic income, and I read a story, for instance, recently that Spain are considering or discussing rolling it out after the lockdown period, as a result of the fact that it's been demonstrated to probably be really necessary and sensible. And this is something I've thought for quite a long time. And yeah, do you think there's space for that? And do you think more people are going to start discussing it after this?
Yeah, I think that the universal basic income is still quite a sort of niche discussion point in the country, if I was to be perfectly honest. But I wrote a different book, and in that book, I wrote about how I supported universal basic income. But I supported it, and I still, very much support it on these grounds. That I hate the element of the welfare system that pitches division of scroungers and workers, and especially as somebody who, I was a young mom myself and I lived on benefits, and the way that the sort of presentation of teenage girls having babies to get council flats, this sort of classic thing, that narrative spreads because, and I didn't realise this until I properly became a representative, is that when you knock the door in, well, in all communities, but in working class communities like the ones I represent, that it feels very real to somebody that their neighbour has something that they don't have and they don't have to work for it. So people will say things like, well, her next door, she's got a couple of kids and she just bought a new Audi and she doesn't go to work, whereas I'm working 38 hours a day and 40 hours at the weekend and I can't afford a new Audi. Now, people don't know what other people's circumstances are, and people make all sorts of different assumptions. But I do feel that sometimes the welfare system, which I totally benefited from and wish to see expanded and supported and made better, it can create this, I don't get anything from the state and I pay my taxes. And I desperately want that level of division to end. And UBI, there is an element of any sort of universal services, whether that's universal child benefit, which no longer exists, of course, or universal healthcare, universal housing, universal education, that means that that feeling of division and the sort of enjoyment of paying your taxes goes away, and so there's a rhetorical element to it for me. When the crisis began, I felt very, very strongly that the best answer to the crisis initially was universal basic income, and I still think that that may well turn out to have been the case, because there's been a huge amount of different problems with the furlough schemes. That some people are getting, I mean, one thing I find really frightening, my husband is furloughed, and he is getting paid, the government is paying for him to stay at home from he works for a small tech startup, and it just doesn't seem right to me in lots of ways that my friends who are nurses are going out and working for less money than the government is paying my husband to stay at home, or not just my husband but other people to stay at home. And I think that an element of the universal basic income would have cut across all of the problems with the self-employed differences, with cut across. How likely I think it is in the future, I would say not likely at all, if I was to be perfectly honest. I think that over their dead body would the Tories consider anything going towards a universal basic income, because they wrongly think that people being given welfare, and I do think that there are really reasonable arguments against that I could also make as well, about how it could work or should work. Like I say, I support it very much in the sort of rhetorical desire to see universality across the board, really. But they wrongly think, conservative rhetoric wrongly thinks that if you give people something to do nothing, because let's say child benefit is doing nothing. I mean, that £36 a week, you could have your money back. You could give me £36 million a week and I wouldn't have another baby. It's the hardest job in the world. They think that it stops you being ambitious. They think that giving you something stops you being ambitious. And until we can break that down, I remember sitting across from a Tory colleague in a debate about tax credits, which I had lived on, both working and child tax credits, saying that he felt that the women who'd worked at his office lacked, it meant that they weren't ambitious, because if they rose over a certain threshold, they'd lose their tax credits, and it stopped them wanting to climb. And I stood up and said, you're standing here with your fancy job, you're so ambitious that you got here, but I got here too, and I lived on tax credits. It didn't make me less ambitious in any way, shape or form.
Jess, that's quite a nice segue into a question that Elizabeth Colwell has asked in the chat. Elizabeth, I don't know if you have your camera on or if you want to come on screen and talk to Jess, but she's asked, where does your motivation and inspiration come from? So we all sort of laughed when you said, oh, I've not had a death threat for a few weeks. That's a really horrendous way to live, but you know, what is it that drives you, apart from this burning sense that everything's not fair?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that I've got three brothers, and they're all older than me, and I feel like I spent my entire life being like, this isn't fair, about everything, and so that's probably the crucible of my it's not fair. The two inspirations that I have, I didn't have like political pin-ups, I'm afraid to say, when I was a kid. I was normal, sorry if anyone feels that I'm their political pin-up and I've just basically said you're not normal, but there's better people than me. Consider some of the pop stars of the current time. But my mum and my nan, and my dad and my whole family were really, really political. But my mum, and it's funny, I didn't write about this in the book, where the book is exactly about people like my mum, and I realised I hadn't written about her when I did a speech about her, about the book. My mum sued the drug company ICI in 1976, I think it was 1976, before I was born, because they had created a drug that was given to my nan for angina and heart problems that my nan didn't have, because they don't properly test things for women, and it dried up my nan's tears. It's the most poetic story, because my nan basically she lost her tears by not having a broken heart, and my mum, who was at the time, she was 26 6 years old. She had 2 children and another one on the way. She lived in a terraced house in the Black Country. Birmingham is posh compared to the Black Country, and she decided it wasn't okay, and she found the women from all across the country who had suffered this disease, and she campaigned and she sued them. I think it was for £8 million. So this is in 1976. So, and she gave all the money out to all of the women. In fact, this sapphire ring that I wear was my mum's, and it was left in her will by one of the women who she had fought for. And
what a woman!
When you grow up with that.
Like where did that come from? That's an extraordinary story.
Yeah, my mum is like Erin Brockovich, but with a bad perm and dungarees. She didn't have a bad perm towards the end of her life. She was very, very chic, but in the 70s, perm. They made a Panorama programme about her, and my brother, I was talking to him about it recently because he was alive then, I wasn't alive, but he was saying all he remembers about the whole thing was that she'd had this perm done for Panorama to come and film in their house, and that she picked him up from school and he just didn't recognise her because she had ridiculous hair. But my son recently did his work experience at the BFI, and he went to their archive and he found the tape of my mum's Panorama, which I've never seen, and it's currently on VHS. So they're putting it onto digital for us so that we can have it. So my mum was an amazing person, and the MP for Yardley at the time stood up in Parliament and talked about my mum. And so if you look at the Hansard record for the place that I now sit in as the MP for Yardley, you can see this man talking about my mum, and he's like, Mrs. Trainer. And he says her address, which you would never do now. God forbid, you'd never give away people's addresses. Right. He says her address and asks people to get in touch with her if they've got cases. So that is what I grew up with. So that's what, if you grow up thinking that you should fight back, then
yeah,
it's amazing how, you know, that it's not genetic, it's learned behaviour.
Yeah, agree. I think that my colleague Katie will be nodding vigorously in the chat, and I'm the same. That yeah, when you have a mum who is a kick-ass woman, it's so you can't shake it off. Try as you might. I think there's somebody in the chat.
I could have been. I wanted to work in a haberdasher's and just look at buttons.
Yeah.
I mean, I was given no choice. Terrible.
Frustrating. Very frustrating. I wanted to come to my colleague Polly. Actually, is Polly there? Just because while we have the opportunity, Polly has done a ton of work all through last year about family separation and the family courts, and has more recently been doing work with people in that world who are trying to handle how you deal with families in complex, difficult situations when everything's gone virtual and digital, and whether that can operate functionally. Polly, are you there?
Yeah, hi. So we've done a series of think-ins over the last couple of weeks looking at the issue of child protection and justice in the courts through this period. And what we've heard about is this complete clash between judges saying our justice process for making decisions about the future of families and children isn't fair enough. It isn't, you know, once you move that process to a digital world, you can't look people in the face and work out what's going on with a family. It's not fair enough. On the other hand, as you were saying earlier, there's more pressure now on families and more pressure down the line as all the effects of poverty kind of build within households that could cause difficulties. You know, one example that was told to us was, you know, there are parents who are managing drug addictions or alcohol addictions with ways to stay with their families. Once you take away their ability to get drugs or their mother's support to keep them together, there's a real crisis for that family, and the social workers can't see them and the schools can't see them either. And I was interested in what you said, Jess, about you mentioned that you thought some of the figures I'm not quite sure whether you were talking about care orders or
I think just more safeguarding children's referrals.
Yeah, the referrals are going up. Yeah, because I mean, it's interesting. I'd love to know from where you are and from what you're hearing from your constituents what's happening in that sense, because we're hearing quite a mixed picture of referrals going up, but actually no capacity to deal with them, and actually the court process going on ice.
Yeah, well, I think that's the same across the board with almost all safeguarding elements, is that there is a mixed picture, and there hasn't been there, and there doesn't seem to be a sort of nationwide repository to work out trends, to look at solutions. There's no perfect solution, unfortunately, that we can offer that means nobody will be abused, but there is solutions around mitigating risk. I have deep concerns about the courts, and how the court's going on ice, what that does. I think that the judges are right in what they are saying about the ability to look a family in the eye, although I've seen some bad judgments, but the ability to look a family in the eye and have people in front of you. I've been really, really deeply concerned about how all disability cases at tribunal are now going to be paper exercises. That's harrowing, the idea that somebody's disability, if not written down properly by them, and when I don't mean properly, I mean people always underplay the things that are wrong with them, and the reality is somebody sat in front of a person is deeply, deeply important. Human connection and the ability to see how things are a strain on you, and the system is a strain on you, is really deeply important. But I am really, really worried about having both child protection and adult protection. There doesn't seem to be this washing up of the mixed messages that are coming from across the country to have a proper nationwide strategy for mitigating risk. And it's the same in domestic violence, it's the same in child protection, that because this is a health crisis, and this is absolutely classic. Anyone who's ever had to go to a shared conference or a group scrutiny about an issue around a vulnerable child or an adult, there is always one partner often that is missing, and that is usually health. And the fact that this is a health crisis, it does really deeply feel like so much of the attention has gone onto the health response, understandably, without thinking about the broader social context and actually what healthiness is for lots of people. And that, I think, in the inevitable inquiry to come, the fact that it wasn't considered as part of the broader strategic planning, I think will come to bear.
Thanks ever so much, Jess, and thanks, Polly. It's just clicked onto 1929, a time, not a date, and so I've
a great year. Was it the Wall Street crash?
I think so.
Yeah, we'll be reliving some of that soon, I think.
And so I just wanted to try to pull out some of the best things we've heard tonight. It's been an absolutely brilliant thinking and brilliant discussion. Thank you so much to Jess, who was obviously super busy, for joining us. I'm pleased we managed to make it in the end. I'm so sorry to the people who've had their hands up, Darryl and Lewis and Justin, who we haven't managed to get to. It's a good sign when there's more people wanting to talk than we have time for. Very important just to reiterate the things that we said earlier in the chat, that if you are concerned about or want to help with domestic violence, find your local refuge, look up Southall Black Sisters and sign the petition, write to your MP. All of that practical stuff is really doable. I like the nation loves an old man in a uniform. Women are as important as bins, which is good, and turns out not only are they as important as bins, but also good at crisis leadership, arguably better than the men. UBI, I think, is a conversation that we will come back to at Tortoise. Jess said that she felt UBI is a niche topic in the discourse at large, but it comes up time and time again in Tortoise thinking. So I think we do probably need to go back round on that one and have a look at it maybe as part of our How We Live Next series, which we're going to run through May. But it really has been absolutely brilliant. I've loved it. There's a lot of love for Jess Phillips in the chat. And in the Tortoise newsroom. So keep chucking on. You're a source of enormous energy and inspiration. Thank you very much. And I hope it all goes well in the virtual House of Commons tomorrow. Who knows what will happen. Have a lovely rest of the evening, everybody. Join us again tomorrow if you've booked in, because we're having some guy called Tony Blair. I don't know if you've heard of him. Tomorrow, and have a nice rest of the evening. Bye, everyone. Bye.